Harlem nights in the late 1950s carried a particular weight, the kind that pressed down on your chest the moment the sun disappeared. Smoke clung to the air, mixing with the smell of whiskey, sweat, and old wood soaked in stories. On this night, something else lingered too. A whisper moved through back rooms and street corners, passed quietly from mouth to mouth. A contract had been signed. A price had been named. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the man many called Harlem's king, was marked for death. Most men would have vanished. Others would have struck first. Bumpy did neither. He walked through Harlem as he always had, measured and unhurried, his shoes tapping against the pavement like a metronome counting down time only he could hear. Faces turned as he passed. Some looked away out of fear, others stared in disbelief. They had heard the same rumors. Everyone had. The Mafia believed his time was up, and in their world, belief often became reality. Inside the familiar room, the lights were low and the music soft, but the tension was loud enough to drown out both. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling, blurring faces into shadows. Conversations died as Bumpy entered. Chairs creaked. Glasses paused halfway to lips. He felt it immediately. The air was wrong, not hostile, not frantic, just heavy, like a held breath waiting to be released. Bumpy took his seat without a word. His fedora rested beside him. His coat stayed on. He didn't scan the room or check the exits. He didn't touch the weapon he carried out of habit. He simply waited. That calm unsettled everyone watching. This was not ignorance. This was intention. Somewhere beyond the walls of that room, a plan was already moving forward, gears turning toward a violent conclusion. And Bumpy knew it. Those closest to him sensed it too. Loyal men exchanged quiet glances, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. No warning was given, no instructions were whispered. Bumpy's stillness became its own command. It told them everything and nothing at the same time. The night stretched on, each passing minute sharpening the question nobody dared ask aloud. What kind of man sits calmly while death schedules an appointment with his name on it? What kind of power allows someone to wait instead of run? Bumpy's face revealed nothing. His eyes held no panic, no anger, only patience. He had lived long enough to understand that violence was not always the final move. Sometimes it was the trap. Outside, Harlem continued breathing. Taxis rolled past. Music spilled from open doors. Life moved forward, unaware that history was balancing on the edge of a single decision. Inside that room, the silence told a deeper story. This was not the beginning of an attack. It was the beginning of a lesson. Bumpy Johnson had already seen what others could not. He knew the bullet was coming. He knew who would carry it, and instead of stopping the moment, he chose to let it arrive. Because whatever happened next would not just decide his fate. It would decide Harlem's. Men in that room felt the shift even if they couldn't name it. Power was no longer about who pulled a trigger, but who controlled the moment before it was pulled. Bumpy's patience rewrote the rules in silence. The calm frightened them more than gunfire ever could, because it hinted at knowledge they didn't possess and timing they couldn't predict. As the night pressed on, one truth settled into every corner of Harlem. Whatever was coming next would not be chaotic. It would be precise, deliberate, and impossible to stop once it began. No one understood yet how completely it would change everything forever that followed. Harlem, in the middle of the 20th century, was not a backdrop. It was a battlefield disguised as a neighborhood. Storefronts, churches, barber shops, and numbers houses all existed under the same unspoken rule. Survival came first. Money mattered, but safety mattered more. And in those years, safety was never guaranteed. Bumpy Johnson understood that better than anyone. He was born into Harlem's pressure and learned early that chaos only attracted predators. Where others ruled with random violence, Bumpy built something steadier. He listened before he spoke. He paid debts when families could not. He settled disputes quietly, long before they turned into funerals. People didn't fear him because he was unpredictable. They trusted him because he was consistent. The Italian Mafia never understood that distinction. To them, control meant domination. It meant squeezing neighborhoods until every dollar flowed upward. Harlem resisted because Bumpy stood in the way. Numbers, money stayed local. Protection meant protection, not extortion. When outside crews tried to muscle in, they found doors closed, phones unanswered, and allies suddenly unavailable. Bumpy didn't need to threaten. His influence did the work for him. Residents saw him not as a criminal king, but as a necessary shield. When landlords tried to evict families who fell behind, rent was paid. When police pressure grew heavy and unfair, it eased without explanation. When young men got into trouble, someone intervened before their lives were ruined. That kind of power created loyalty deeper than fear ever could. This balance terrified the Mafia. Harlem, under Bumpy, was stable, and stability meant resistance. They couldn't buy him. They couldn't intimidate him. And every year he remained standing. Their grip on New York felt weaker. Bumpy wasn't just protecting territory. He was protecting dignity, something organized crime rarely respected. To remove him wasn't simply a business adjustment, it was an invasion. Without Bumpy, Harlem would fracture. Numbers houses would fall, street crews would fight. Outside syndicates would pour in and strip the neighborhood bare. Everyone knew it. That's why the whispers about a contract felt heavier than usual. This wasn't about profit margins, it was about control. Bumpy understood that too. He carried the weight of Harlem's future with him every day. His calm wasn't arrogance, it was responsibility. If he fell, the floodgates would open. He was the wall holding back something far worse than a bullet. That made him dangerous in a way the Mafia couldn't tolerate. Power built on respect spreads quietly and lasts longer than fear. And as long as Bumpy Johnson lived, Harlem belonged to itself. That truth forced the Mafia into a corner. If they wanted Harlem, they would have to remove the man who made it untouchable. And they would have to do it carefully, because killing a king openly starts wars no one can control. The danger was not that Bumpy inspired violence. It was that he prevented it. His presence kept rival crews from tearing streets apart and kept outsiders guessing. Without him, uncertainty would spread faster than gunfire. Men would rush to fill the vacuum, and Harlem would pay the price. The Mafia understood this pattern well. They had seen neighborhoods collapse when leadership disappeared. Chaos made money, but it also drew attention, and attention brought consequences. Bumpy's quiet authority delayed that cycle. His existence slowed time, forcing enemies to plan instead of react. That patience made him more threatening than any army of soldiers. It meant his removal required subtlety, not spectacle. That realization shaped everything that followed, pushing his enemies toward deception rather than open war, and setting the stage for a betrayal that would test loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of power. The consequences would echo through Harlem long after that night ended for everyone watching. When the decision was finally made, it did not happen in the open. There were no raised voices, no slammed fists, no dramatic declarations. It happened quietly, in rooms where the curtains stayed closed and the men inside spoke in measured tones. The 5 families had reached the same conclusion after years of frustration. Bumpy Johnson could not be pushed, bought, or scared away. If Harlem was ever going to fall, Bumpy had to be removed. Violence alone would not work. Too many eyes watched him. Too many loyalties surrounded him. Killing him in the street would ignite a war that would cost money, men, and attention nobody wanted. So they chose a method older and far more effective. They would turn someone he trusted. Loyalty is a fragile thing when pressure is applied correctly. Every man has a weak point, and the Mafia specialized in finding it. They did not look for greed first. They looked for desperation, fear, obligation, love. Somewhere in Bumpy's inner circle was a man who carried more than loyalty on his shoulders, a man with needs Bumpy could not see. That was when the conversation shifted from strategy to selection. Names were mentioned, dismissed, reconsidered. Then one name settled into the room and did not leave. A bodyguard, a brother in everything but blood. Someone always close enough to touch Bumpy's shoulder. Close enough to stand behind him without raising suspicion. Close enough to end everything in a single second. The moment that name was spoken, the plan crossed the line of no return. From that point on, Harlem's future was no longer theoretical. It had a price attached to it. The number itself mattered less than what it represented. $50,000 was not just payment. It was temptation measured against conscience. It was a test of what loyalty was truly worth. To the men approving the contract, this was not personal. It was arithmetic. Remove one man, gain an entire neighborhood. Harlem's numbers, its streets, its silence. They believed power could be purchased like anything else. That belief had worked for them before. It blinded them now. What they failed to consider was the cost of betrayal beyond the act itself. Turning an insider does more than eliminate a target. It poisons trust everywhere else. It teaches every man watching that loyalty has a price tag. That realization alone can destroy empires faster than bullets. The contract moved forward without ceremony. Instructions were passed discreetly. Meetings ended with nods instead of handshakes. To the Mafia, this was efficiency. To Harlem, it would be devastation. No one outside those rooms was supposed to know a decision had been made at all, and yet the most dangerous part of the plan was never the gun, the money, or the man chosen to pull the trigger. It was the assumption behind it, the belief that Bumpy Johnson was unaware, that he could be studied without studying back, that his calm was ignorance rather than calculation. By the time the contract was finalized, something had already gone wrong. The secret was no longer contained, not because someone talked, but because Bumpy Johnson understood human nature too well to miss the signs. While the Mafia congratulated themselves on subtlety, Bumpy was quietly watching loyalty bend under pressure. The hit was sanctioned. The price was set. The traitor was chosen. And somewhere far from those back rooms, Bumpy Johnson already knew exactly what was coming. He did not move to stop it. He did not confront it. He waited. Because what he planned next would not just expose betrayal, it would redefine power itself. That night would become legend, whispered in Harlem for generations, warning enemies what patience truly meant forever and always. 3 weeks can feel like nothing, or like a lifetime, depending on what you're waiting for and whether you believe the future can change. Bumpy Johnson treated those 3 weeks as currency, spending each day observing without reacting, listening without speaking, and allowing events to unfold as enemies expected. He did not confront the betrayal when he sensed it, because confrontation would end the lesson before it truly had time to breathe fully. Instead, Bumpy watched the man he trusted wrestle silently with fear, loyalty, and desperation, knowing pressure reveals character faster than threats ever could alone themselves. Small details told him everything: shaken hands, distracted eyes, sudden absences, and forced smiles that never reached places honesty usually lives inside the human soul. Bumpy tested loyalty without accusations, changing routines, rearranging meetings, watching who adapted calmly and who panicked when expectations shifted unexpectedly under quiet pressure conditions. He could have stopped the plan at any moment, but stopping it would only protect himself, not Harlem, or the future he carried inside always. By letting betrayal continue, Bumpy gained something far more valuable than safety: clarity about who stood with him when it truly mattered most in life. This was not revenge brewing quietly. It was control being refined patiently, shaped with intention rather than anger over time, through silence, discipline, and restraint. Bumpy understood that revenge satisfies emotion, but control reshapes outcomes, teaching lessons that echo long after anger fades within communities, minds, memories, and history itself. Every day he waited increased the risk. Yet, it also increased the impact of what was coming for everyone: watching, listening, calculating, fearing, guessing, silently. Bumpy never tipped his hand, never showed concern, never broke routine, because predictability kept suspicion exactly where he wanted it, resting comfortably among assumptions unchallenged. The traitor believed the plan remained hidden. Believing silence meant ignorance, mistaking patience for blindness, and assuming power always reacts loudly, immediately, violently, publicly, first. Bumpy let that belief grow because confidence makes people careless, and carelessness exposes truths secrecy never can. When time stretches, pressure builds, fear whispers steadily. Behind his calm expression, Bumpy mapped outcomes, not just survival, but the message Harlem would remember afterward for decades, through stories, warnings, silences, glances, pauses. He knew the attempt would happen publicly, where witnesses mattered, where lessons could not be buried or denied afterward, remembered, repeated, respected, feared, learned deeply. Waiting required courage few possess, because waiting means trusting knowledge over instinct and restraint over fear when danger feels immediate, personal, unavoidable, suffocating, close, real. Each passing hour sharpened the edge of inevitability, drawing the moment closer with unbearable slowness felt by everyone, sensed, measured, counted, breathed, watched, anticipated, endlessly. Bumpy accepted the danger fully because avoiding it would only postpone the same confrontation under worse conditions later. Bloodier, louder, messier, public, uncontrolled, chaotic, inevitable. He chose the moment carefully. Understanding timing determines whether violence destroys or educates those watching, learning, listening, remembering, judging, aligning, surviving, adapting, fearing, respecting, obeying. This patience confused enemies, calmed allies, and concealed a strategy unfolding silently beneath ordinary routines seen as harmless, predictable, boring, static, unchanged, repetitive, safe, dull. Behind closed doors, Bumpy prepared nothing dramatic. No speeches, no warnings, only certainty built on observation, memory, experience, loyalty, betrayal, truth, patience, timing, silence, resolve. He knew when the trigger was pulled, the real impact would follow afterward. Not before inside minds, reputations, alliances, histories, territories, families, streets, myths, forever. The plan was no longer about stopping death, but about shaping what death attempted to take: power, respect, unity, control, meaning, future, legacy, dignity, permanence. As the final days passed, inevitability settled gently, guiding everyone toward a moment none would forget once, witnessed, remembered, repeated, whispered, taught, feared, respected, forever. The room was full the way Harlem rooms always were on a Friday night, packed shoulder to shoulder with sound, smoke, and history. Jazz rolled gently from the bandstand, notes drifting between tables like lazy conversations. Glasses clinked. Laughter rose and fell. No one noticed the moment to begin because nothing looked different at first. Bumpy Johnson sat where he always did, relaxed, engaged, his back turned slightly, the picture of routine comfort. The bodyguard stood near the edge of the room, close enough to feel the music vibrate through the floor. He had stood in that same place countless times before. Tonight, his heart hammered so loudly he wondered if others could hear it. Sweat gathered under his collar. His hand brushed the weight inside his jacket, grounding and terrifying him at the same time. The room shifted subtly as he took his first step forward. No alarm sounded. No eyes followed him. Familiarity made him invisible. He moved through the crowd naturally, like he belonged there because he did. Every step shortened the distance between thought and action, between hesitation and consequence. Bumpy leaned slightly toward the man beside him, mid-sentence, unaware to anyone watching that time had narrowed to a single line. The bodyguard raised the gun. The motion was smooth, practiced, almost gentle. His finger found the trigger. In that instant, the room still breathed. Music played. A trumpet sang. Then he pulled. The sound that followed was not a gunshot. It was smaller, sharper, somehow louder. A click. Dry metal against nothing. The note from the trumpet died mid-air. Conversations collapsed into silence. Glasses froze in hands. 300 people turned, yawned at once, staring at the same impossible image. The gun did not fire. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The silence pressed down harder than noise ever could. The bodyguard stared at the weapon as if it had betrayed him. His grip tightened, then loosened. The truth spread through the room faster than fear. Something was wrong. Something had changed. Bumpy Johnson did not jump. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not shout. He lifted his glass calmly, took a slow sip, and set it down with care. Then he turned in his chair. His eyes met the bodyguard's, steady and knowing. There was no anger in his face, no shock, only certainty. In that moment, everyone understood the same thing at the same time. This was not luck. This was design. "I've been counting on you," Bumpy said quietly. The words carried farther than any gunshot ever could. They landed heavy, final and undeniable. The bodyguard's knees gave way. The gun slipped from his hand and clattered against the floor, the sound echoing in the stunned quiet. Faces around the room registered disbelief, then awe, then fear. Power shifted in that instant, not because a man had survived, but because a truth had been revealed. Bumpy Johnson had known. He had waited. And he had turned an assassination into a lesson without spilling a drop of blood. No one rushed forward. No one spoke. They understood they were witnessing something rare, something that would be remembered long after the music resumed. Silence had become the weapon, and it had struck deeper than violence ever could. Bumpy stood slowly, commanding attention without asking for it. The room leaned toward him, hanging on every movement. What had just happened was no longer about a failed hit. It was about what came next, and every person there knew their world had shifted forever. Bumpy Johnson did not raise his voice or call for blood. The room waited, tense and confused, expecting violence to correct violence because that was how these moments usually ended. Instead, Bumpy chose something far more unsettling. He chose mercy. He looked down at the man who had just tried to kill him. A man exposed in front of everyone who mattered. The bodyguard was alive, breathing, trembling, and completely broken. Death would have been quick. What Bumpy offered instead would last much longer. Bumpy spoke calmly, his words measured not for the traitor alone, but for every witness in the room. He did not insult. He did not threaten. He explained. Loyalty, he said, was not something you rented. It was something you earned every day through action, protection, and respect. Money could buy silence, fear, even obedience, but it could never buy honor. And Harlem, he reminded them, ran on honor. The room absorbed every word. Men who had lived their lives by codes older than the streets understood the meaning instantly. Survival, in this case, was not forgiveness. It was the sentence. By letting the traitor live, Bumpy stripped him of everything that mattered. His name was finished. His reputation was gone. No door in Harlem would open for him again. No table would welcome him. No man would trust him with a secret, a favor, or a future. He would carry his failure wherever he went, known not as a survivor, but as a cautionary tale. This was the punishment no bullet could deliver. Death ends pain, shame does not. Shame follows you. It eats quietly, relentlessly. Every day you wake up knowing who you were and what you lost. Bumpy understood that truth better than anyone in the room. He made it clear that night that loyalty was not blind. It was reciprocal. He took care of his people, and in return he expected honesty, even when desperation made betrayal tempting. The lesson was sharp but fair. The traitor had been given chance. He had made his choice. Now he would live with it. Around the room, men lowered their eyes, not out of fear, but recognition. They understood the line that had been drawn. Violence was not the foundation of Bumpy's power. Accountability was. He did not rule by terror. He ruled by consequence. Bumpy allowed the man to stand, to walk, to leave with his life intact. Every step toward the door felt heavier than chains. Everyone watched him go, knowing they would never see him the same way again. Some would never see him at all. Then Bumpy addressed the room one last time. His words were not a threat. They were a reminder. Harlem was not for sale. Its people were not commodities, and anyone who believed otherwise would learn the difference between money and respect the hard way. The room remained silent as he finished speaking. No applause followed. None was needed. The lesson had landed. In choosing mercy, Bumpy had demonstrated absolute control. He had shown that power did not require blood to prove itself. Sometimes the most terrifying outcome was being allowed to live, fully aware of what had been taken from you and why. As the music slowly returned and conversations resumed, something fundamental had changed. Those present would carry this moment with them, repeating it in whispers, passing it on as warning and wisdom. Harlem had witnessed justice delivered without violence, and the message traveled farther than any gunshot ever could. What happened in that room did not end there. It moved outward, beyond Harlem, beyond the night, into places where decisions were made and alliances were measured. Mercy, wielded correctly, had reshaped the balance of power. And the consequences were only beginning to unfold. By the time the sun rose over Harlem, the story had already left the neighborhood. It moved faster than newspapers, faster than phone calls meant to stay private. Men who had not been in that room felt as if they had been, because the message was unmistakable. A hit had failed. A traitor had been spared. And Bumpy Johnson had turned an assassination attempt into a public demonstration of control. Within hours, word reached the highest levels of organized crime. The reaction was immediate. Emergency meetings were called, not out of rage, but confusion. This was not how things were supposed to unfold. The plan had been clean, discreet, final. Instead, it had become something else entirely. Violence was the expected response. Retaliation was the rule. But now, violence carried risk no one wanted to calculate. Killing Bumpy after what had happened would no longer look like business. It would look desperate. Worse, it would confirm that they were reacting to him, not controlling the situation. Around heavy tables and guarded rooms, leaders listened as the details were repeated. The failed shot, the calm response, the mercy. Each piece made the same point clearer. Bumpy had known. He had waited, and he had chosen the moment with precision. That kind of foresight unsettled men who believed they understood power. The usual options were considered and dismissed. Another hit would only raise questions. A public war would bring unwanted attention. Turning more of his people now seemed impossible. Loyalty in Harlem had just been reinforced in the most visible way imaginable. Bumpy had exposed the limits of money as leverage. That lesson could not be undone. The conversation shifted from action to assessment. What would it cost to continue? How many men would it take? How much noise would it generate? And most importantly, how many more moves ahead was Bumpy already? That was the question no one could answer. For the first time, retreat entered the discussion. Not framed as weakness, but as strategy. Harlem, they concluded, was no longer worth the effort. It was fortified by something harder to fight than guns. It was unified by respect, and as long as Bumpy Johnson stood at its center, any attempt to take it would come at a price that exceeded the reward. The decision shocked everyone who heard it. Harlem would be left alone, not absorbed, not divided, not contested, off limits. This was unprecedented. Territories were fought over, not surrendered. Yet here was an exception carved out by one man's patience. Bumpy had changed the rules without firing a shot. He had made it clear that every move against him would be seen, anticipated, and reshaped. Those who understood strategy recognized what had happened. Power had shifted from force to foresight. Bumpy's value was no longer just in what he controlled, but in what he prevented. Chaos had been avoided, blood had been spared, and the cost of challenging him had become too unpredictable to justify. In Harlem, life continued, but with a subtle difference. People felt it. The pressure eased, the sense of being hunted lifted. Outside, crews stayed away. Inside, loyalty deepened. The message was clear even to those who never heard the full story. Harlem was protected, not by fear, but by intelligence. Beyond Harlem, the story grew. It was told in fragments, embellished in places, simplified in others. But the core remained intact. Bumpy Johnson had stared down death and turned it into leverage. He had made the Mafia blink first. What mattered most was not that the 5 families backed down. It was why. They had recognized something they could not overpower. A man who saw further than they did. A leader who understood that the strongest position was one where enemies chose not to move at all. The immediate danger had passed, but something larger had been set in motion. The night had changed Harlem's future, and the consequences would stretch far beyond that single decision. Bumpy Johnson's influence was no longer confined to the streets he walked. It had become part of a larger legacy, one that would outlive the moment and redefine what power truly meant. When people later spoke about Bumpy Johnson, they often started with violence, but they ended somewhere else. They talked about the night the bullet never arrived, and how everything changed afterward. Years passed, and Harlem moved on in its familiar rhythm of struggle and resilience. Bumpy remained a presence, older now, slower but still deliberate. He did not die in a hail of gunfire or slumped over a card table. He died quietly from a heart attack in a place he knew well. Fate, not a trigger, closed his story. What endured was not fear, but memory. The lesson from that night settled deep into the bones of the neighborhood. Men remembered how power had shifted without a single shot. They remembered the silence after the click, and how it carried more weight than any explosion. Harlem learned that strength did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited, watched, and chose the exact moment to speak. Bumpy's legend grew precisely because he resisted the easy path. Violence was simple. Anyone could pull a trigger. What separated him was restraint. He understood that the most dangerous move was the one your enemy never expected. By allowing the attempt to unfold, he exposed a truth many never learned. Control was not about stopping threats immediately. It was about shaping outcomes so completely that resistance collapsed on its own. Older men passed the story down like a warning and a guide. Respect, they said, was not demanded. It was demonstrated. Loyalty could not be purchased at the right price. It had to be earned through protection, consistency, and fairness. Bumpy had lived by those principles long before that night, and the night only made them impossible to ignore. Silence became part of his mythology. He did not boast. He did not explain himself to outsiders. He let the results speak. That restraint traveled far beyond Harlem. Even those who disliked him understood what he represented. A man who could end a war by doing nothing at all, at least nothing visible. Years later, when he was gone, the stories did not fade. They sharpened. Harlem remembered the calm in his voice, the certainty in his posture, the way chaos seemed to bend around him. The neighborhood remembered that for one suspended moment, an entire system of power hesitated, recalculated, and stepped back. That is why the lesson outlived the bullet. Guns age. Enemies disappear. but foresight remains. Knowing what is coming and deciding when not to act proved more powerful than force. Bumpy Johnson showed that intelligence could outmaneuver violence and patience could disarm hatred. In the end, his legacy was not built on bodies or blood. It was built on understanding human nature. Fear creates rebellion. Respect creates order. When the choice was offered, Harlem chose to remember the man who protected it by thinking further than anyone else. The night he waited for death became the night he secured his place in history, not as the loudest or the most ruthless, but as the most prepared. And, long after the music resumed and the smoke cleared, one truth remained. The most dangerous weapon was never the gun. It was knowing exactly when the gun would fail. It was a lesson carved into memory, whispered in back rooms and front stoops alike. Those who understood it survived longer. Those who ignored it disappeared faster. Harlem carried the story forward, not as myth but as instruction. Power favored the patient, the observant, the ones who listened more than they spoke. That truth, born from a single click in the dark, outlived every rumor, every rivalry, and every man who thought force alone could rule. It remains a warning and a guide long after the streets forget names.